welcome to Moses podcast, learning around API and customer observability. Joining us today is Mike Amundsen, leader and expert within the API ecosystem, especially both around machine observability, but also talking about product observability. And so, Mike, we'd love to hear just a little bit about yourself and what comes to mind when you hear the term observability or especially customer observability.
Yeah, well, first of all, it's great to join you, Derric. I always enjoy talking with you. We don't get to do it often enough, so I'm happy to be here and to share. You and I have talked about this before. I think of observability as that way to figure out what's really going on and how that can affect a customer, how that can affect a product, how that can affect the experience. I tend to think of observability a lot of times from the design perspective. How can we design early on in the process, design the ability to monitor, the ability to observe, and the ability to react in ways that positively affect the product. So I tend to think, sort of on the server side, things like machines and services and products, different versions of observability, but also just the design side as well.
Awesome. And you mentioned, customer observability and some of this more machine level stuff. How do you differentiate between these different types of metrics? And what would be some different examples in terms of different key metrics to track?
Yeah, so starting sort of on the machine side of things, I think people are pretty familiar with sort of that machine level observability metrics collection, things like latency or memory or disk space or response time or error rates. These are just sort of things that the nuts and bolts of getting the system up and running and working. And they're important, they're good because they tell you whether or not you're healthy, but they don't really say much about what's going on with your product, what's going on with the services between those machines. And I think those are really important as well. So thinking about service ability, so how many completions, of a cart checkout, how many abandoned carts, how many times have we had errors on connecting to another API? That's sort of the service layer. And then you think about the product itself. How long does it take a customer to complete a task? How can do they abandon doing the work? Do they not understand? Do they make common mistakes over and over again? So observing just the way people behave, the way your service reacts to them is also really critical to helping you build a good product, I think.
Makes sense. And does this change the approach to observability? It's one thing to track something like uptime, but tracking a cart checkout, there's a lot of different ways to run into an issue with the cart checkout experience. So how do you wrap your head around what to be tracking and making sure that we're tracking the right things?
Right. I think that's an excellent question. Like you had pointed out, people sort of understand how to do the basics of machines, but how do you start tracking other bits? I think that's where the design part comes in. Early in the design, when you're designing the API itself, I'm going to want to pay attention to this transaction, this notion of completing a payment or selecting a shipping or collecting the information I need in order to serve this customer better, or the amount of time it takes this customer to fill out this sort of complex onboarding experience. So the way I design very often has that monitoring built in. So there's a constant thread and activity. So you design in the idea of identifying the customer experience itself, not just the user, not just the service they're doing, not just the authentication or the authorization, but just having a tag on this service experience and then collecting that experience, I think gives us an opportunity to start to say, hey, did you notice it takes a lot of time to do X? Everybody seems to slow down when we get to this point in the story. Maybe we need to re-engineer, redesign the product or re-engineer the service to improve it. So I think putting on that design hat, I think, is really important in the way I think about it.
I really like that, taking it from the initial design versus, treating observability as an afterthought, because otherwise, you start running into trying to bolt on and Band-Aid a product and maybe not even tracking the right things. You're just kind of throwing observability into, the kitchen sink in a way.
Yeah.
How do you incorporate that in terms of a design process? What is kind of the best practices, especially for design architecture teams who are, thinking about shipping, new APIs?
Yeah, I try to encourage teams to think the way I was just kind of saying about there's an experience or there's a flow. Onboarding is experience, checkout is an experience, selecting a product is experience, approving a contract is an experience. And those are targets for monitoring and observability. So I want to monitor how this experience goes. So anything that touches that, you think about workflows, those are sort of experiences, but anything that touches this particular flow or this experience is a chain in the, something that I want to monitor. So I want to monitor the amount of time it takes is a great way to start thinking about it. But I also want to monitor things like, did they abandon the process? Did they stop? Did they have to save for later and come back for more? Did they get hung up on some feature that seems complicated, like creating a list or something like that? So really identifying those things is really important. I'll say another thing. When we think about observability and monitoring, I mentioned things like how long does it take or did they abandon? These are what I call proxies. These are proxies for what people are experiencing. And they may not be very good proxies. So one of the other things I think is really important is to be prepared to say, maybe measuring the amount of time it takes is not the right measure. That's not the pain point for the customer. Maybe the amount of time the customer has to do before they even show up on your website, collections and things, maybe that's the pain point. Maybe the way we're asking for information. So sometimes I think, especially at the product or at the customer level, you need to be pretty creative. You need to get customers in a room and see how they behave and see what they do. And that becomes a much better proxy or representation for what you want to monitor and observe and can affect the way you create your product.
That's a really good point. And, we speak on things like time to first API call or time to first hello world. And, these types of metrics they're very cross-functional. It, impacts docs to, the actual API experience and, can they get to an open API spec really easily? And, what does it take to complete that business transaction? But what does that mean from an ownership standpoint? Who owns customer observability? And, how do you ensure you have the right process to be tracking against those metrics that you're defining?
Yeah, that's a good one too. I encourage this notion of product ownership. Whoever's designated as the product owner or the product owner team, however your organization kind of fits that, they're the ones that need to be looking out for these experiences I just mentioned. They often need to be the customer's voice in the room kind of experience. You think about, not just for user interfaces, but for APIs. Often, the API dev rel, the developer relations person, is the customer in the room, and they need to be pretty vocal and pretty attentive to whoever that target audience is. If it turns out that we've got a target audience of a lot of enterprise developers, I've got to spend time in the enterprise space and I got to kind of own that experience. And it's my job to translate whatever those enterprise people say into things that make sense for our product team, our developer team, our design team. And that goes for, all kinds of audiences, I think. So I tend to think of this observability as this way for people to inform products on how they can better, support customers.
Awesome. And just changing gears a little, we've heard this term API product manager, and more recently, I guess AI product manager is now becoming a thing. And
Yeah.
what does that mean? Should you have a product manager for your APIs? And if so, what is their day-to-day responsibilities like? What is their goals and responsibilities?
Yeah, that's a good one too. My short answer is yes, you definitely should have a product. You should have a product owner, even for internal APIs. So if my job is to create a set of APIs to make other developers in our organization more productive, more effective, make fewer mistakes, get things done with higher quality in a shorter amount of time, that's my product. What can I do? I often think of product owners as the ones that sort of carry water for everyone else. What can I do to make your job better? How can I improve this experience, reduce the amount of time, improve the quality without added effort. And that doesn't matter whether it's the APIs you're creating or the APIs that I might go out and vend or purchase. Like you know what, we're not going to do address management. Let's get an API, a third party to help us do address management, make sure we're doing things correctly, or taxes, or all sorts of other things. But now I'm kind of responsible for making sure that those APIs work well inside our ecosystem. So even if you're dealing with third-party product APIs, I think there's a person who's kind of owning that experience as well. In small organizations, that may all be the same person. In large organizations, you may need to break that up in lots of different ways.
I like that, treating your APIs as products, even in internal organizations where you have other teams and business units that might be the customer in this case, and you need to treat them as a customer just like a external customer.
Yep.
But me as an API product manager, what should I be tracking in terms of business outcomes, as the API matures and eventually potentially a end of life scenario? We can talk about different experience metrics and adoption metrics. Is it always the same, or is it evolving? And how do I think about what I should be looking at from a observability standpoint?
Well, I think of this, again, sort of putting on a product owner hat. There's a life cycle in every product, right? It's a new product. It's an experiment. We're not sure if it's going to really solve the problem we think it solves, or it's going to get the uptake we think it's going to, it's going to get. Maybe if it takes off, then there's this period where people keep trying to improve it. It's sort of realizing its potential. It's realizing its earnings potential, or it's whatever its payback is, reduced amount of time for internal things and things like that. And eventually there's going to be some point in this API where it's kind of paying off. It's doing what it should do. And that's probably a good time to leave it alone. As a product owner, it's not really a good idea for me to invest more time and money into changing this API. It'll probably take it a bit more afield from what its original purpose was. If we need some other behaviors, maybe we need to create a new API. Leave this one alone. Let this one churn. When you think about products, you get a great design, you get a great audience. There have been some products that have been on the shelf for 60, 70, 80 years, and they're still serving their customers just fine. They don't need a new box. They don't need a new label. They don't need new ingredients. They just need to stay the way they are. And so you can, my goal as a product owner is to get a lot of that maintenance life, a lot of that. I want to make sure it stays healthy, clean. Maybe I'll fix some bugs, but I'm not going to introduce a lot of new material. Eventually, that product's going to get passed over. People don't use it as much anymore. People don't need it as much anymore. Sometimes you build an API to solve a problem, and within a year or two, that problem is solved. So then it's time to deprecate that whole thing. And we can sort of talk about what that means, but really that life of an experiment, realizing value, maintaining that value over time, and eventually, retiring that API, I think happens for every product, both physical and virtual. And as a product owner, I should know where each of these products are on that life cycle. This one's early, this one's in maintenance mode, this one needs to be retired. And that's part of being a good product manager, I think.
I really like that approach of being pragmatic before we don't need to replace and recode every single service and API out there if there's no value in doing that. That's just you're creating work for the work's sake of it.
That's right.
Speaking more around delivering value through APIs, and we speak on this a lot at MOSA. How do you measure value, and how do you ensure that the APIs that you shipped 2, 3, or 5 years ago are still creating value? And then how do you determine when does it make sense to deprecate? At a certain point, you do have to deprecate.
Yeah, that's really good. The sort of the value proposition is kind of baked in the beginning, right? We need to reduce the amount of time it takes to onboard a new customer, or we need to increase customer engagement to the point where they're using the product, 10% more than they were last year. We have some kind of engagement thing to start, some kind of a metric. Then we need to see if that metric really gets realized. We really have changed the amount of onboarding time. We really are getting more engagement in messages or comments or whatever the thing is. So that means that I'm paying attention to how many comments there are, how many new people we bring on board, and how many people stay on board over time. So I have to come up with observability monitoring elements that make that observable to me in some dashboard or something like that. So I have to pay attention. Now, eventually, if I'm paying attention, I might find that the number of people using this API is dropping off. Now, sometimes that drop off is because I look at observability and we're getting some errors. We introduced a problem or something like that. Sometimes that drop off is just that audience is getting smaller. So that's kind of, once I know what those value propositions are and I know what the steady stream is, if I notice it's starting to wane, it may be time to deprecate. And that means deprecation is kind of a involved process. I need to figure out, is there going to be a replacement for this? Do we have one that's already built that's better, that's more appealing to our audience or solves the problem in a better way? Or do we just not need it anymore? So I got to make sure there's an option to replace it, or that I know that it doesn't need to be done anymore. Then I've got to give people a chance to get used to the notion that this is not going to be here. And depending on the audience, if you've got a large audience, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of sites, not just developers, but organizations, that's going to take some time. They can't just stop on a dime. And you need to offer them alternatives. You need to say, we have a new API that's much faster and better. Or you need to say, there are other options out there. Or you need to say, we're going to open source our interface if you want to replace this thing. There's a whole set of deprecation elements that eventually end up to the point where you're not updating anymore, you're not doing security fixes anymore, and finally, you're just not taking any traffic anymore. And that's the life cycle. That's a circle of life. That's kind of the way it goes. And every organization needs to face those.
You have to face it, and as long as you're not pissing off people by shutting something off tomorrow, then usually it's okay, right? But as long as there's a plan of action that someone can take, and hopefully a good enough time period to do that within, then that usually helps a lot. Speaking a little bit more around what can go wrong, what do you see some of the pitfalls around customers' observability, or just in terms of determining the right metrics, in terms of maybe tracking too much or tracking too little?
Right. That's actually great. So there's sort of the classic case where the observer affects the experiment. You want to make sure you're not overloading so much transactional information and internal metrics that you affect the performance of the product itself. You want to make sure you don't change your design to be more amenable to observability than it is to customers, right? Observability and monitoring, that's the behind the scenes job. That's behind the curtain work that we all do. That's the hard part. It should be super easy for developers. And then it goes to the thing we've talked about earlier about selecting proxies. A lot of times you're kind of figuring where the value in something is. You can think of a cloud service where people are uploading a lot of photos and then having a lot of social interaction with other people. The value is that they get a lot of social interaction and so on and so forth. So you start monitoring and you start even designing a product to sort of pay off on the social interaction part. Interaction activity becomes sort of the business value that you're making. Well, it may turn out that storage is actually a better proxy for success than interaction. So if you pick the wrong proxy, you might create a billing model, you might create a whole marketing campaign that really doesn't add the value that you think is most important to your customer. So you have to be prepared to change proxies in some kind of ways or rethink. You need to constantly talk to customers. So I think that's a big challenge too. I've seen products launch on assumptions about what their value add is and not really go through the work early on in the product stage to know if that value is really going to pay off, and end up, one, maybe not having a successful product, or worse, having a successful product that doesn't pay revenue on the value add that you thought it was. It's on some other thing that you're paying a lot more money for, and you're upside down. You end up paying more for storage or paying more for traffic than you are collecting. So I think those are the things that I think of that off the top of my head.
That's a really good point around understanding and being open to changing those proxy metrics. And we're seeing this especially within the Gen AI space where naturally API is relatively cheap. It had some storage related to it or some CRUD apps behind, the scenes. But these days with more and more data APIs and Gen AI APIs, there's real costs to consider. There's real costs. So getting that type of observability to understand, are you upside down? Are you underwater in terms of, generating revenue for the business is becoming more and more important.
Yeah, and you bring up a really good point. I'm really seeing we're still very early in the curve in the hype phase or whatever you want to call it on these Gen AI situations, but there's a big push on AI-driven agents of some type. That becomes a whole new customer for your API, right? That's a whole new kind of client. They have their own pains and their own troubles. Like, for instance, most of these AI agents really have a limited amount of memory. You can't just keep shoving a whole bunch of data at them in order to have them figure out how to use your API. You're going to have to start designing this API specifically for the Gen AI agent community. That's like designing for mobile or designing for one community or another community. So I think this is going to be really, really important. And it's a great example of what you just mentioned, where when you get these bots that are kind of involved with your API, they could really throw off your metrics, really throw off your value add, and you have to be prepared to pay attention. Right now, I'm telling customers to be very, very observant and monitor exactly who is making these calls and watch for when you get automated AI calls, because that could be a brand new market for you or a brand new threat or both.
Indeed, indeed. And sometimes watching for that unintentional abuse, it's not necessarily a bad actor in a way. They're just accidentally, handed your API the wrong way, but your bill still is going up. And so making sure that you are able to detect that and, prevent, some massive overage fee or some massive spend overruns is now becoming more important.
Or to work it the other way, it's not just you as the host having a massive spend, but all of a sudden maybe your customers who are using your API to generate revenue or manage their costs are suddenly upside down as well. You don't want them to end up with a huge bill that they don't understand because somebody else is starting to use their API in, as you say, unintended ways. And often, honestly, excuse me, unintended ways are often great gifts. Like, this is a whole new value add that we can manage, that we can take advantage of, but you can only do that if you're really observing your API and you've got good proxy metrics.
Sounds like great power comes great responsibility. APIs already give you, a lot of different ways to integrate, but with the AI agents, it's even becoming an explosion of different use cases and different ways to get value out of the platform. So I like your point around you have to be even more diligent around observability for these types of new products. My last set of questions is really around, how is observability and the API space changing, especially with, the proliferation of Gen AI and both from an observability standpoint, leveraging AI to, understand and uncover those insights, and vice versa around, AI itself, right? Because, at the end of the day, they are APIs under the hood.
Yeah. The line is, there is no AI without APIs, right? Like, it's probably a truism that we all need to remember. I can say that, years ago, I won't say how many because of, just tell everybody how old I really am. We used to focus, so much on machine observability because we were writing all our own code. We were consuming all our own code. We were hosting all our own code. So that seemed to be what monitoring and observability really meant, paying attention to keeping your house in order. But as the last 10 years, we've used so much cloud service. We're using so many other people's APIs, whether, like I said, it's tax services or user management or even, marketing or release management. And now we've got this whole idea of cloud services being run by AI. That what's really happened, I think, in this observability space and in this product management space for APIs is it's just gotten more and more complex. Not just complicated, not just more players, but more and more different kinds of players that interact with each other. So the job of being a product manager, whether you're internal and external, really ends up, you have to be able to observe and pay attention to and make, find value in your own APIs, other people's APIs, the cloud platform, other client applications. That's a huge job. And organizations that pay attention to that span and have someone or some team that looks at that in their organization, I think they're the ones that are going to get ahead in this next round of innovation that involves mostly AI.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, there's just more and more use cases, more data to look at, and now you have to interpret it. You have to understand, is this the right decision to grow my team or business, and understand where I need to invest.
Yep.
Any last takeaways in terms of customer observability and what's happening in the API space?
I guess the thing I would just say more than anything else is it seems silly, but pay attention. Make sure you're paying attention because things are changing so quickly. And like I said before, unintended use is happening more and more often, and it's often a gift. So if you pay attention, you can be on sort of the leading edge of the curve. You won't get so surprised, and sometimes you might end up actually well ahead of your competitors because you saw this before other people do. Observability is a fantastic tool for improving your business. So pay attention all the time.
That's a really good point, which is it's one thing to have observability in place, but you have to look at it, set up the right alerts,
Yeah,
set up the right dashboards,
exactly.
make sure, is there a process, at the organization to make sure, are you getting the most value out of the observability?
That's a really great. Is there a process to vet this material, not just figure out what's happening, but what does it mean, and are we willing to experiment? That process is really good. That's a great idea, Derric.
Well, thank you so much, Mike, for having us on the podcast here, and looking forward to sharing this with our audience.
I'm looking forward to it too, and I'd be happy to come back anytime. Thanks a lot.
Appreciate it.